Let's picture the room where this all started, because the setting matters more than people remember. Beverly Hills, March 2018. A conference space with floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of room where studio deals get done over Fiji water and branded notepads nobody uses. Jeffrey Katzenberg, then 67 years old, stood in front of a slide deck that reportedly cited a statistic he repeated in nearly every pitch afterward. The average American checks their phone 150 times a day. He wasn't selling an app. He was selling a theory of human attention, and he had the Rolodex to make people believe he'd cracked it. In the room were executives who controlled distribution for hundreds of millions of households. Katzenberg didn't need to convince them Hollywood could make good content. He needed to convince them Hollywood could make good content that fit inside a pocket, between a stoplight and a subway turnstile. And because of who he was, the man behind The Lion King's $763 million worldwide box office, the man who built DreamWorks Animation from nothing into a company that went public and later sold to Comcast for $3.8 billion in 2016, nobody in that room laughed. He spoke, according to people present, without notes, pacing slightly, gesturing at a mock-up phone screen mounted on an easel, describing what he called quick bites, premium cinematic storytelling engineered for exactly the in-between moments of a day that traditional Hollywood had never bothered to monetize. Meg Whitman brought a different kind of credibility. She'd taken eBay from $4 million in revenue in 1998 to $8 billion by the time she left in 2008. She'd run for governor of California in 2010, spending $144 million of her own money in a losing campaign, then rebuilt her reputation running Hewlett-Packard through a brutal split into two companies. She understood boards, she understood burn rate, she understood how to project calm competence to nervous investors. Katzenberg brought the vision, Whitman brought the appearance of discipline. Together, their pitch had a rare quality in Silicon Valley fundraising. It didn't feel like a bet on an unproven founder. It felt like a bet on two people who had already won, twice, doing it again. Reporters who covered the early fundraising described investor meetings that lasted barely 45 minutes, unusually short for checks this large, because so much of the diligence, apparently, had already been done by reputation alone. That's why the money didn't trickle in. It flooded in. Disney's early commitment reportedly signaled to the rest of the industry that this wasn't fringe experimentation, and once Disney was in, NBCUniversal followed, then WarnerMedia, then Sony Pictures, then Alibaba's international arm, then Goldman Sachs writing a check as if this were infrastructure, not entertainment. By the time the first funding round closed in 2018, Quibi had gathered $1 billion without a single show filmed, without a single line of the app's code finalized for public use, without so much as a beta test in front of ordinary consumers. A second round in 2019 pushed the total past $1.75 billion, a figure that made Quibi one of the best capitalized media startups in history, before a single subscriber had ever pressed play. To put that number in context, $1.75 billion was more than the annual GDP of some small nations, more than Netflix's entire original content budget in 2013, and it had been assembled for a company whose product, at the time the money was wired, existed mostly as a rendering on a slide. With that money came enormous appetite for star power, because Katzenberg believed, correctly in a 1998 context and catastrophically incorrectly in 2020, that famous faces moved units. He signed deals reportedly worth 8 figures combined, for a slate that included Jennifer Lopez in a competition format called Legendary, Idris Elba in Hot Ones-style unscripted shorts, LeBron James producing sports commentary content, Chrissy Teigen hosting a game show called Chrissy's Court, adjudicating small claims disputes. Sophie Turner, Liam Hemsworth, and Anna Kendrick signed on to scripted thriller Survive. The math was straightforward and, in hindsight, deeply flawed. Over 175 shows commissioned before launch, a content budget exceeding $1 billion, with individual episodes costing on average more per minute than a network television drama. all engineered to run in chapters of 7 to 10 minutes. Some estimates put certain scripted shows at costing upward of $100,000 per minute of finished footage, a rate that rivaled prestige cable dramas, spent on stories designed to be watched once on a train and rarely thought about again. Then came the engineering obsession that, in retrospect, tells you everything about where Quibi's priorities sat. Katzenberg was fixated on a feature called Turnstyle, technology allowing a video to reformat seamlessly, whether you held your phone upright or sideways, without cropping or black bars. Quibi patented it. Engineers spent, by some internal accounts, more than $100 million and the better part of 2 years perfecting it. It was, undeniably, a clever piece of software. It was also a solution to a problem virtually no user had ever complained about, while far more urgent gaps, no ability to screenshot a favorite scene, no Chromecast support at launch, no ability to watch on a television at all until months after debut, no social sharing button anywhere in the app, sat unresolved. You could not airdrop a clip to a friend. You could not post a 15-second moment to Instagram stories. In an attention economy running entirely on shareability, Quibi had engineered virality out of its own product by design, reportedly because Katzenberg worried that free clips floating around the internet would cannibalize the $10 a month subscription he was counting on. Then the timing collapsed underneath them in a way no spreadsheet could have modeled. Quibi's public launch date, April 6, 2020, had been locked in roughly a year earlier, back when the biggest headwind anyone anticipated was competition from Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus, not a once-in-a-century pandemic. By the time launch day arrived, the United States had recorded over 400,000 confirmed COVID cases. Most major cities were under stay-at-home orders, and the very commuters Quibi had built its entire 7-minute format around, the person power walking to catch the 8:15 train, the parent waiting in a school pickup line, the traveler killing time at gate 22, simply did not exist anymore. Reports later surfaced that Katzenberg himself acknowledged, in a call with employees, that the company's core use case had essentially evaporated overnight. Yet the launch proceeded anyway, because with $1.75 billion deployed and hundreds of contracts signed, there was no version of the plan that allowed for delay. The marketing effort tried to paper over the mismatch with sheer force. Quibi ran a Super Bowl ad on February 2, 2020, during Super Bowl 54, reportedly paying somewhere between $5 and $6 million for 30 seconds of airtime in front of over 100 million viewers. A spot that promised, content designed for you, on the go, wherever you go. 6 weeks later, nobody was going anywhere. Billboards across Los Angeles and New York, wrapped subway cars in Manhattan, sponsorships at airports, an entire campaign built around the physical act of movement through the world, went up right as the world stood still. Employees later described watching the ad buys roll out in real time on television news, split-screened against images of empty freeways and shuttered storefronts. A kind of dramatic irony almost too on the nose to be believed. The download numbers looked survivable at first glance. Roughly 910,000 people downloaded the app in its first week, enough that Katzenberg told reporters he was pleased with the reception. But downloads measured curiosity, not commitment, and Quibi had built its entire financial model around a 90-day free trial, converting into long-term $4.99 or $7.99 monthly subscriptions. When those trials began expiring in July 2020, the churn was brutal. Fewer than 8% of trial users converted into paying customers, a conversion rate that industry analysts called catastrophic by any streaming benchmark. For comparison, Disney Plus, launched just 5 months earlier in November 2019, hit 10 million subscribers within 24 hours and crossed 50 million within 10 months. Quibi, spending comparable money on content, never got close to 1 million paying subscribers during its entire existence. Inside Quibi's Santa Monica offices, the mood reportedly shifted from cautious optimism to quiet panic within weeks of launch. Employees who spoke to journalists at Vanity Fair and the Wall Street Journal described a workplace where dissent rarely traveled upward, where the app's shortcomings, the missing casting to television, the absent social features, the awkward in-between length of the shows themselves, too long to feel like TikTok, too short to build the emotional investment of a 45-minute episode, were known internally almost from day one, but were never seriously addressed before launch. One former employee described the company's response to bad user feedback as polishing a car with no engine. Casting to television, arguably the single most requested feature among early users who wanted to watch premium content on something other than a 5-inch screen, wasn't added until May 2020, nearly 2 months after launch, by which point the narrative in tech press had already calcified. Quibi was the app nobody asked for, solving a problem that no longer existed. By June 2020, Katzenberg was publicly acknowledging in interviews that the pandemic had torpedoed the business, a framing that let him attribute Quibi's failure to an unforeseeable act of nature, rather than a fundamental miscalculation about how modern audiences actually behave online. But the deeper diagnosis, the one media analysts kept returning to, had nothing to do with COVID. Short-form video was thriving in 2020, just not Quibi's version of it. TikTok crossed 2 billion global downloads that same year and was approaching 1 billion monthly active users, built entirely on user-generated content that cost the platform nothing to produce, spread through an algorithmic feed that Quibi had no equivalent of, and thrived precisely because of the shareability Katzenberg had engineered against. The irony was almost unbearable. Quibi spent over $1 billion trying to manufacture premium short-form content from the top down, while a free app built by teenagers proved the entire category could be built from the bottom up for almost nothing. By October 21, 2020, Katzenberg and Whitman signed a joint letter to employees, investors, and partners announcing the company would shut down, just 6 months and 15 days after launch. The letter cited a difficult, humbling, and important journey, and pointed to the pandemic, the unproven business model, and the format itself as compounding failures no single fix could have solved in time. What the letter didn't dwell on was the number that mattered most. Of the $1.75 billion raised, the vast majority was gone. Spent on content licenses, celebrity contracts, engineering for features like Turnstyle, and marketing campaigns including that Super Bowl ad watched by over 100 million Americans who, days later, largely forgot the app existed. What remained, the content library and the underlying technology patents, sold to Roku in January 2021 for approximately $100 million, a sale that returned investors somewhere around 6 cents for every dollar invested. For the roughly 200 employees at Quibi's peak headcount, the shutdown meant severance packages and an abrupt end to jobs many had left secure positions at Netflix, Hulu, and traditional studios to take, lured by Katzenberg's reputation and the sheer scale of capital behind the venture. Some had relocated entire families to Los Angeles for the job, signing leases in Santa Monica and Culver City on the strength of what looked like a can't-miss opportunity backed by nearly every major studio in Hollywood. For investors like Disney, WarnerMedia, and Goldman Sachs, the loss was material but survivable, a rounding error against balance sheets in the tens of billions. For Katzenberg personally, it was a rare, very public failure, attached to a 50-year career defined almost entirely by hits. A reminder that no amount of institutional trust guarantees an accurate read of a completely new medium. What makes Quibi worth dissecting years later isn't simply the size of the number, staggering as $1.75 billion remains for 6 months of runtime. It's the pattern underneath it, the recurring corporate delusion that credentials from one era transfer automatically into the next. That a man who understood 1994's audience must understand 2020's. That capital and connections can substitute for genuine cultural instinct. Katzenberg built the most expensive, most star-studded, most technologically over-engineered version of an idea that free 15-year-olds with ring lights had already solved for the cost of a phone and a Wi-Fi connection. The gap between watching something and wanting to share it turned out to be the single most valuable piece of information in the entire streaming industry. And nobody in that Beverly Hills conference room in 2018 had thought to ask about it. If you want to see which company gets autopsied next, subscribe to Corporate Autopsy and turn on notifications, because the next collapse is already loading.